The National Electrical Code, or NEC, Section 300.5 outlines the minimum cover requirements for underground electrical raceways and cables. Understanding these requirements is crucial for ensuring electrical safety and compliance. Let's delve into the specifics of NEC 300.5 and address the question of whether a 12-inch cover is adequate under 2-inch concrete, regardless of traffic. NEC 300.5 provides a table specifying minimum cover depths for various scenarios. These scenarios take into account factors like the type of raceway or cable, the voltage level, and the presence or absence of vehicular traffic. One specific row in the table stipulates that for non-metallic raceways in a trench below 2 inches of concrete or equivalent, a minimum cover of 12 inches is required. Another row addresses situations where the raceway is under a 4-inch thick concrete exterior slab with no vehicular traffic, mandating a minimum cover of 4 inches. However, the row pertaining to areas under streets, highways, roads, alleys, driveways, and parking lots specifies a minimum cover of 24 inches. The question arises because the row mentioning a 4-inch cover explicitly states no vehicular traffic, while the row for the 12-inch cover makes no mention of vehicular use. This leads to the inquiry of whether it can be assumed that 12 inches is adequate under 2-inch concrete, regardless of traffic. The NEC doesn't explicitly state whether a 12-inch cover is adequate under 2-inch concrete regardless of traffic. However, we can infer some guidance from the code's language and general principles. The table in NEC 300.5 doesn't explicitly require a 24-inch cover for locations under 2-inch concrete with no vehicular traffic. Therefore, a reasonable interpretation is that a 12-inch cover would be sufficient in these situations. For situations with vehicular traffic, the code requires a 24-inch cover under streets, highways, roads, alleys, driveways, and parking lots. Note that the NEC doesn't specifically address 2-inch concrete in this context. It's possible that the 24-inch cover requirement is intended only for thicker concrete slabs. The absence of specific language addressing 2-inch concrete with vehicular traffic leaves room for interpretation. To ensure safety and compliance, consulting with a qualified electrician or local code official is highly recommended. These professionals can provide guidance based on the specific circumstances of the installation, local amendments to the NEC, and any relevant interpretations. Consider the following points when determining the appropriate cover depth. Firstly, the type of raceway or cable being used. Different types of raceways and cables have varying degrees of protection against physical damage. Rigid metal conduit, or RMC, for example, offers greater protection than electrical non-metallic tubing, or ENT. The type of raceway or cable can influence the required cover depth. Secondly, the voltage level. Higher voltage installations typically require greater cover depths to minimize the risk of electrical shock. Thirdly, the potential for physical damage. If the raceway is located in an area where it's likely to be subjected to physical damage, such as from heavy equipment or digging, a greater cover depth may be necessary. Fourthly, local codes and regulations. Local jurisdictions may have amendments to the NEC that specify different cover depths. It's essential to comply with all applicable local codes and regulations. Fifthly, manufacturer's instructions. The manufacturer of the raceway or cable may have specific recommendations for cover depth. Following the manufacturer's instructions is crucial for ensuring the product's proper performance and longevity. Sixthly, the presence of other utilities. If the raceway is located near other utilities, such as gas lines or water pipes, coordination with the utility companies is necessary to avoid conflicts and ensure safety. Seventhly, the soil conditions. The type of soil can affect the raceway's ability to dissipate heat and resist corrosion. In areas with corrosive soils, a greater cover depth or additional protection may be required. Eighthly, the expected traffic load. If the area is subject to heavy vehicular traffic, a greater cover depth may be necessary to prevent damage to the raceway. Ninthly, the use of concrete encasement. Enclosing the raceway in concrete can provide additional protection against physical damage. If concrete encasement is used, the required cover depth may be reduced. Tenthly, the need for future access. If future access to the raceway is anticipated, a greater cover depth may be necessary to allow for excavation without damaging the raceway. In summary, while the NEC doesn't explicitly address the scenario of 12-inch cover under 2-inch concrete with vehicular traffic, it's generally advisable to consult with a qualified electrician or local code official to determine the appropriate cover depth. They can consider all relevant factors and provide guidance based on the specific circumstances of the installation. Here's a further breakdown of the relevant considerations. Let's focus on the scenarios outlined in NEC 300.5. For a non-metallic raceway in a trench below 2 inches of concrete, the NEC specifies a minimum cover of 12 inches. This requirement is generally straightforward and applies to situations where a thin layer of concrete is used to protect the raceway. When dealing with a 4-inch thick concrete exterior slab with no vehicular traffic, the NEC allows for a minimum cover of 4 inches. This reduced cover depth is permitted because the concrete slab provides adequate protection against physical damage and the absence of vehicular traffic minimizes the risk of impact. In areas subject to vehicular traffic, such as streets, highways, roads, alleys, driveways, and parking lots, the NEC mandates a minimum cover of 24 inches. This increased cover depth is necessary to withstand the heavy loads and potential impacts associated with vehicular traffic. The key question is how to interpret the NEC requirements when dealing with 2-inch concrete and the possibility of vehicular traffic. The NEC doesn't explicitly address this specific scenario. Therefore, a degree of interpretation is required. One approach is to consider the intent of the NEC, which is to ensure electrical safety and prevent physical damage to raceways. In situations where there is a risk of vehicular traffic, even with a 2-inch concrete layer, it may be prudent to adhere to the 24-inch cover requirement. This would provide an extra margin of safety and minimize the risk of damage. Another approach is to consult with a qualified electrician or local code official. These professionals can assess the specific circumstances of the installation and provide guidance based on their experience and knowledge of local codes and regulations. They may also consider factors such as the type of vehicular traffic expected, the soil conditions, and the type of raceway being used. It's important to note that the NEC is a minimum standard. In some cases, it may be necessary to exceed the minimum requirements to ensure safety and compliance. For example, if the raceway is located in an area with heavy vehicular traffic or poor soil conditions, a greater cover depth may be warranted. Additionally, it's crucial to ensure that the raceway is properly installed and protected. This includes using appropriate fittings, connectors, and supports, as well as providing adequate drainage to prevent water from accumulating around the raceway. Furthermore, regular inspections and maintenance are essential to identify and address any potential problems before they become serious. In conclusion, determining the appropriate cover depth for underground raceways requires careful consideration of the NEC requirements, the specific circumstances of the installation, and the advice of qualified professionals. By following these guidelines, you can help ensure electrical safety and prevent damage to raceways. Let's further expand on the considerations for interpreting NEC 300.5 regarding cover depth, particularly when dealing with scenarios not explicitly addressed in the table. Firstly, understand the definition of cover. The term cover refers to the distance between the top of the raceway or cable and the finished grade or surface above it. This measurement is crucial for ensuring compliance with the NEC minimum cover requirements. Secondly, consider the equivalent protection mentioned in the code. The NEC often uses the term equivalent to allow for flexibility in meeting the code's requirements. In the context of cover depth, equivalent protection could refer to measures such as using a thicker concrete slab, encasing the raceway in concrete, or providing additional physical protection. Thirdly, evaluate the risk assessment for vehicular traffic. Determining the likelihood and severity of vehicular traffic is essential for deciding on the appropriate cover depth. Factors to consider include the type of vehicles expected, the frequency of traffic, and the potential for impact. Fourthly, review local amendments and interpretations. Local jurisdictions may have their own amendments to the NEC or interpretations of the code's requirements. It's crucial to be aware of and comply with all applicable local codes and regulations. Fifthly, consult with electrical inspectors for clarification. The electrical inspectors are responsible for enforcing the NEC and ensuring that electrical installations are safe and compliant. Consulting with an electrical inspector can provide valuable guidance and help avoid potential violations. Sixthly, document your reasoning and justification. When deviating from the NEC explicit requirements, it's important to document your reasoning and justification for the chosen approach. This documentation can be helpful in demonstrating compliance to inspectors and addressing any potential concerns. Seventhly, consider future changes to the site. If there are plans to modify the site in the future, such as adding landscaping or changing traffic patterns, it's important to consider how these changes may affect the cover depth requirements. Eighthly, use engineering judgment when necessary. In some cases, the NEC may not provide clear guidance on a particular situation. In these instances, it's necessary to use engineering judgment to determine the safest and most appropriate course of action. Ninthly, prioritize safety and compliance. The primary goal of any electrical installation should be to ensure safety and compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. When in doubt, it's always best to err on the side of caution and provide a greater degree of protection. Tenthly, seek professional guidance when unsure. If you're unsure about the appropriate cover depth for a particular installation, it's always best to seek the guidance of a qualified electrician or electrical engineer. These professionals can assess the specific circumstances of the installation and provide expert advice. To further illustrate these concepts, let's consider a few examples. Firstly, a non-metallic raceway is installed under a 2-inch concrete sidewalk in a residential area. While the sidewalk is not typically subject to heavy vehicular traffic, there is a possibility that a delivery truck or other vehicle could drive over it. In this case, it may be prudent to provide a greater cover depth than the minimum of 12 inches, perhaps 18 inches or 24 inches, to provide an extra margin of safety. Secondly, a rigid metal conduit is installed under a 4-inch concrete slab in a parking lot. While the NEC allows for a minimum cover of 24 inches in parking lots, the rigid metal conduit provides a greater degree of physical protection than non-metallic raceways. In this case, it may be acceptable to reduce the cover depth slightly, perhaps to 18 inches, provided that the installation is properly engineered and documented. Thirdly, an electrical cable is installed under a 6-inch concrete slab in an industrial facility. The facility is subject to heavy vehicular traffic, including forklifts and other heavy equipment. In this case, it may be necessary to provide a greater cover depth than the minimum of 24 inches, perhaps 30 inches or 36 inches, to withstand the heavy loads and potential impacts. These examples illustrate the importance of considering the specific circumstances of the installation and using engineering judgment to determine the appropriate cover depth. Remember to always prioritize safety and compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. In conclusion, determining the appropriate cover depth for underground raceways and cables requires a thorough understanding of the NEC requirements, the specific circumstances of the installation, and the advice of qualified professionals. By following these guidelines, you can help ensure electrical safety and prevent damage to raceways and cables. Remember that consulting with a qualified electrician or local code official is always the best course of action when unsure about the appropriate cover depth for a particular installation. They can provide guidance based on the specific circumstances of the installation, local amendments to the NEC, and any relevant interpretations.